Disrespectful cop sets up black woman not knowing she's his new police captain. Welcome to a story where nothing is what it seems and no one is who they claim to be. Picture a determined black woman returning to her old neighborhood with hope in her heart, only to be thrown into a nightmarish tangle of corruption and deceit. Imagine a hardened, racist cop ready to make her life miserable for reasons that go beyond the color of her skin. Little does he know, his victim holds the very power that could bring him down in an instant. Get ready for twists, drama, and a moment of karma so satisfying you'll want to cheer. Lucas James stared out the window of her rented SUV as the familiar skyline of Chicago rose in the distance, its towering buildings reflecting the orange hue of the setting sun. The broad expanse of Lake Michigan shimmered, a testament to the city's magnificence. She could hardly believe she was back. After a decade away, spending years on the East Coast, climbing the ranks of a different police department, she now found herself returning to her hometown, equipped with a new title that carried tremendous responsibility: captain of a specialized unit in the Chicago Police Department. She couldn't wait to make a difference in the place that had shaped her. Yet Lucas's heart carried a mixture of anticipation and unresolved memories. She had grown up in the neighborhood of Bronzeville, where she learned life's hardships early on. Her mother used to say, "Sometimes we have to step away from home to see it clearly." Lucas hoped that applied now. She had stepped away all right, and accomplished so much. But the city she was driving into had changed, or perhaps Lucas was the one who had changed. Either way, she'd soon find out. Her discreet return was by design. Officially, Lucas would not start her new position for another 2 weeks, but she preferred to arrive incognito to get a sense of the real climate among the officers. She knew that once her identity was revealed, people would behave differently. In her experience, it was best to catch a precinct off guard, to see how they handled business when they weren't worried about impressing a superior. After hearing whispers that her new department had problematic officers, Lucas decided she would investigate those rumors from the shadows first. Pulling off the expressway, Lucas glided down Martin Luther King Drive, passing blocks that told Chicago's story. Hopeful murals on abandoned buildings and freshly renovated community centers sitting across from boarded-up storefronts. It was a tapestry of contradictions, struggle and resilience woven together. This was where Lucas had grown up, absorbing street smarts that had served her well in her police career. She finally parked outside a modest apartment building near the south side. She had quietly rented a small unit to stay in during her observation period. Leaning back in the driver's seat, Lucas allowed herself a moment of reflection. She was not the same hopeful teen who'd left for the academy years ago. Now she was a seasoned officer, fully aware that her skin color carried weight, both in the community she was sworn to protect and in the force she represented. Just as she reached to open her car door, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Chief Morris, the man who'd orchestrated her transfer. "Welcome back to Chicago. Hope to see you soon. Let me know if you need anything." Lucas smiled. If she did her job right, Chief Morris would have plenty to hear about soon. Several miles away, Harold Harry Matthews strolled into the 12th Precinct station, a smug grin plastered across his face. Officer Matthews was a Chicago native too, but his experiences and attitudes had led him down a darker path. He joined the CPD fresh out of high school through a police cadet program, spurred on by a father who served for 30 years on the force. But while his father had a reputation for fairness, Harold had developed a different reputation, one tinged with prejudice and a willingness to bend the rules. Standing in the station's cramped locker room, Harold slipped on his uniform shirt as he chatted with his partner, Officer Luke O'Donnell. They'd been partners for 3 years, patrolling everything from the touristy downtown to neighborhoods overshadowed by crime statistics. Luke was younger and more idealistic, often uncomfortable with Harold's offhanded, racially charged remarks, but he lacked the courage to challenge someone so deeply entrenched in the department's old guard. That morning, Harold had received an anonymous tip about potential drug activity in Bronzeville. He smirked. Bronzeville was an area he loved to prowl for easy arrests. In his twisted perspective, people of color were automatically suspects. He believed he could plant enough evidence to justify any stop. And worse, he knew how to play the system, giving him the sense that he was untouchable. "Ready for a fun shift?" Harold asked Luke sarcastically, slamming the locker door shut. Luke lifted an eyebrow. "Sure, where are we headed?" "Bronzeville." "Got a tip," Harold replied, waving a piece of paper, "and let's just say there's a good chance we'll be catching some real nasty folks off guard." Luke shrugged, not wanting to provoke Harold's temper. He zipped up his jacket, and the two made their way to their squad car. In the parking lot, the early evening sun cast long shadows, reflecting the tension that would soon build. Harold's personal life was a mess, a pending divorce, financial troubles, and a thick disciplinary file he managed to keep suppressed through family connections. But none of that stopped him from strutting around the station as if he owned the place. And tonight, as he drove through the winding streets, a quiet thrill coursed through him. He was hoping for a big bust to pad his record, or at least some drama he could spin to his advantage. What Harold didn't realize was that an even bigger drama was about to enter his life, one that would shatter his illusions of power. His so-called lucky break in Bronzeville would eventually expose the very thing he worked so hard to hide, his blatant racism, backed by corruption and the arrogance that he was above the law. Night had settled over Bronzeville, and Lucas stepped out of her small apartment after changing into casual clothes. She had a black hoodie pulled over a plain t-shirt and jeans, her hair braided neatly, a comfortable look that helped her blend in. Before diving headlong into work, she wanted to grab a coffee, get a feel for the streets, and see if any tension was palpable. She felt a familiar hum of energy, the same pulse she remembered from her youth. She turned onto a busier avenue, passing a boarded-up convenience store where kids used to hang out. Now it stood silent, a relic of an economy that had abandoned this block. Lucas's phone buzzed again. It was a text from an old friend, Letitia, welcoming her back and asking when they could meet. Lucas decided she'd see Letitia once she had a better sense of the changes in the neighborhood, both good and bad. Spotting a small coffee shop that had managed to survive the years, Lucas stepped inside. She ordered a latte and looked around at the few patrons, some playing on their phones, others staring aimlessly. Across from her sat a middle-aged man with a hoodie pulled low, seemingly half asleep. As Lucas sipped her coffee, she recalled the first time she'd seen a police officer in uniform. She was a child, and that officer was her neighbor's cousin, an inspiration who had treated everyone on the block with fairness. That memory was part of the reason she joined the force. Now, Lucas hoped to embody that same integrity, albeit at a higher rank. After finishing her latte, she exited the coffee shop into the crisp Chicago air. She debated heading back to her apartment, but decided to walk another few blocks, letting the city speak to her senses. She observed the graffiti, the new murals, the closed storefronts. She also noted the presence, or absence, of regular patrols. A single squad car turned the corner at one point but sped by without a second glance. About 15 minutes into her walk, headlights flashed behind her. The squad car slowed and Lucas heard a sharp chirp of the siren. "Hey you! Stop right there!" a harsh voice commanded over the loudspeaker. Lucas's pulse quickened, but not out of fear. She was used to such calls. She turned calmly, raising her hands slightly to show she posed no threat. The squad car came to a stop, and out stepped Harold Matthews, his eyes shining with an unsettling eagerness. Luke stepped out on the passenger side, looking markedly uneasy. Harold's gaze flickered over Lucas's face, her clothes, then lingered suspiciously on her hoodie. "What are you doing out here?" he barked. "Let me see some ID." Lucas fought to keep her composure. She had no intention of revealing her rank just yet. She reached into her pocket slowly, retrieving her driver's license. Harold snatched it away, examining it under the streetlight. "Lucas James, huh?" he muttered. "You got any warrants?" Lucas shook her head. "No, officer. I'm just visiting family. I grew up here." Harold studied her with a sneer. "Visiting, sure. he scoffed, as if he had heard it all before. Luke stood behind Harold, mouth tight, eyes darting nervously from Lucas to his partner. Lucas noticed Luke's discomfort and took a mental note. Perhaps Luke wasn't as rotten as Harold appeared. Without warning, Harold grabbed Lucas's arm and spun her toward the squad car. "Hands on the hood," he ordered. Lucas complied, swallowing her pride. This was precisely the type of behavior she'd come to investigate, though she never expected to be on the receiving end of it so soon. Harold patted her down, and while it wasn't excessively rough, it certainly wasn't gentle or respectful. "You carrying anything you shouldn't be carrying?" he asked. "No," Lucas replied calmly, determined not to escalate the situation. Then came the question Lucas knew was coming. "Why are you in this neighborhood at this time of night?" Harold demanded again, as though the presence of a black woman on a public street was inherently suspicious. Lucas turned her head slightly. "I have every right to be here. I just finished grabbing a coffee down the block." "You want me to believe you're just strolling around for no reason? This neighborhood's not exactly a tourist spot, Miss James." Harold's voice dripped with sarcasm. Luke finally stepped forward. "Harry, maybe we should just check her ID in the system and move on." Harold waved him off, ignoring Luke's suggestion. Instead, he pressed Lucas's arms further down on the hood. "You wouldn't mind if we just looked around your pockets, right?" "I already told you, I have nothing illegal on me," Lucas insisted. "I'm unarmed. I'm not a threat." "People always say that," Harold said. "Then they end up having something they shouldn't." He glanced at Luke, who hesitated but ultimately started fishing a small flashlight out of his belt. Lucas kept her hands firmly planted, trying not to roll her eyes. At that moment, Lucas noticed Harold flick something onto the ground near her feet. It looked like a small baggie. Her heart thumped. Was he planting drugs? "Look what we got here," Harold proclaimed, stepping back as if in surprise. "A bag of white powder right by your foot." Lucas's anger surged, but she bit her tongue. She had run into corrupt cops before, but to see this blatant racism and fabrication of evidence made her blood boil. If she exposed her rank now, it could compromise her plan to observe the precinct. Still, she couldn't let this escalate into an arrest for a fabricated drug charge. "Officer," Lucas began carefully, "that bag is not mine." Harold smirked, crossing his arms. "That's what they all say. Turn around. You're under arrest for suspicion of possession." He made a show of pulling out his handcuffs. Lucas glanced at Luke, who looked stricken with guilt, but said nothing. Lucas had to make a quick decision. She could allow herself to be arrested, see how far Harold would take this. But then she'd likely be booked, fingerprinted, thrown into a cell. That would be humiliating, though it might be the perfect evidence of corruption. Alternatively, she could reveal her identity right here and watch Harold squirm. But doing so might scare him into covering up his tracks. As Lucas wrestled with her choices, Harold gripped her wrists, snapping the cuffs onto them. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. The irony wasn't lost on Lucas. She was hearing the Miranda rights from a colleague in the worst possible circumstances. For a moment, Lucas allowed Harold to continue, deciding the evidence of wrongdoing might serve her later. She'd find a way to get word to the right people. The wheels in her mind were already turning. Luke stepped in. "Harry, are you sure about this? We haven't even—" "Shut your mouth, O'Donnell." "Let me do my job," Harold snapped. With that, Lucas was gently pushed into the back of the squad car, the door slamming behind her. She stared through the cage partition at Harold, who climbed into the driver's seat with an air of triumph. The engine roared and Lucas felt her heart pound. She was heading to the station, handcuffed on trumped-up charges by a man who had no idea she was actually his soon-to-be captain. This was not how Lucas had envisioned her first night back in Chicago, but in a strange way, it was exactly the confirmation she needed. There were indeed rotten cops in her new precinct, and she'd just encountered one. The fluorescent lights of the 12th Precinct's booking area buzzed overhead, creating harsh shadows on the faded green walls. Lucas followed Harold's brisk commands to the letter, still wearing the cuffs. Despite the humiliating circumstances, she walked with poise, studying every detail around her. The staff at the front desk gave only cursory glances. None recognized her. Why would they? She was out of uniform and brand new to this precinct. They led her to the fingerprint station. A surly clerk took her prints, glancing at Lucas with weary eyes. Lucas realized the clerk had likely seen 1,000 arrests come through these doors and simply assumed she was another perp. The uniform she would soon wear as captain was worlds away from this vantage point. Harold stepped aside to make a phone call, leaving Lucas momentarily alone in the presence of Luke and the booking clerk. Luke cleared his throat, looking at Lucas with a mixture of pity and anxiety. Lucas caught his gaze. She saw a flicker of conscience in his eyes. He was caught in a moral dilemma and possibly searching for a way out. She almost spoke to Luke, but the clerk interrupted, gruffly instructing her to stand for a mugshot. Lucas complied, feeling the cold lens capturing her face. A single photograph that would remain in the department's system, one she hoped to expunge once this fiasco was sorted out. Still, every moment was painful evidence of how quickly justice could be twisted by someone in power. When Harold returned, he scribbled notes onto the booking sheet, ignoring Lucas completely. Luke fiddled with the pen, seemingly wanting to speak up, but too intimidated by Harold's presence. Lucas decided she would remain silent about her identity for now. She wanted to see just how far Harold would push this, and she needed the system to reveal its cracks. If the precinct had procedures to check for body camera footage or mandated evidence logs, Lucas wanted to see whether Harold would circumvent those protocols. "Put her in a holding cell," Harold ordered the clerk. "We'll question her in a bit." Lucas's heart twinged, but she nodded stoically as she was led away. The corridor to the holding cells smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant, the air thick with tension. Her cell was small, containing a single metal bench. The door clanked shut behind her. For the first time in her career, Lucas was locked up in the same place she would soon command. She perched on the bench, resting her hands on her knees. Thoughts swirled in her mind. How would she contact Chief Morris or the right person within the department? She'd left her phone and her personal belongings at booking. She didn't want to risk revealing her identity to the wrong people. Someone might tip Harold off, giving him time to cover his tracks. No, Lucas needed to ensure her eventual reveal was perfectly timed. An hour crawled by. Lucas kept a calm demeanor, practicing some breathing exercises she'd learned over the years to manage stress. Occasionally, she'd hear the clang of the outer door, followed by footsteps. Several detainees came and went, placed in cells around her. One was a distraught teenager, tearful and calling for his mother. Another was an older man who reeked of alcohol, ranting about police brutality. Each voice was a stark reminder of the day-to-day tragedies that too often defined precinct life. Finally, Harold returned, accompanied by Luke. Their body language spoke volumes. Harold strolled with cocky confidence, while Luke hung back, arms folded tightly, as if trying to shield himself from guilt. Harold rapped on the metal bars. "Get up. Let's go for a little chat," he said. Lucas stood, stepping forward. Harold unlocked the cell door, grabbing Lucas by the arm, unnecessarily rough, but not outright abusive. He escorted her down the corridor to a dimly lit interrogation room. Luke hovered behind, leaving the door open. Inside, the interrogation room was stark. A metal table, 3 chairs, and a camera perched in a corner. Lucas noted that the red recording light on the camera was blinking, which meant their conversation would be documented. She wondered if Harold would try to manipulate the footage, or if the precinct's system had real-time data backups that would hamper any tampering. This was Chicago, after all, where checks and balances often collided with internal politics. Harold motioned for Lucas to sit. "Let's cut to the chase," he began, leaning forward with a predatory grin. "You were in possession of a small baggie containing what appears to be cocaine. You want to tell me where you got it?" Lucas set her jaw. "I already told you, officer. That's not mine. It was on the ground." "On the ground," Harold echoed mockingly, glancing at Luke, who shifted uncomfortably. "Sure. You just happened to be standing right over it?" "Yes. Maybe someone else dropped it." You found it near me, but that doesn't make it mine, Lucas said, keeping her tone level. Harold folded his arms. Let me guess. You have no idea how it got there, right? You're just an innocent bystander out on a late-night stroll. Lucas sighed, maintaining eye contact. Exactly. Harold scribbled a note on the file in front of him. Any priors? You have a record? No. He glanced at Lucas's ID again. Lucas James, age 35. Lived in Boston for the past several years. Before that, you were a Chicago resident. So what brought you back? Lucas shrugged. Family reasons. Harold closed the file folder, leaning back in his chair with a derisive snort. Well, Miss James, I think you're lying. I've seen your type 1,000 times. You think you can waltz back into Chicago, do your little deals under the radar, and walk away scot-free, not on my watch. At that, Lucas felt a surge of rage bubble up. His words, dripping with prejudice, were vile enough. But the arrogance, the absolute certainty he could railroad her, was maddening. She forced a neutral expression, simply replying, I'd like to speak to an attorney. Harold's lips twitched, revealing how much he disliked hearing that. I bet you would. Fine. We'll arrange one for you eventually. He stood up. Stay put. The door slammed behind him, leaving Lucas alone in the small, oppressive room. She looked up at the camera, wondering who, if anyone, was watching live. In her old precinct on the East Coast, a captain or lieutenant would typically monitor any interrogation, ensuring protocols were followed. Was that happening here? And if so, would they recognize Lucas's face? Luke suddenly poked his head into the room, glancing behind him nervously. Hey, he said in a low voice, stepping inside. Listen, I'm sorry about all this. I feel this isn't right. Lucas studied him, noting the tremor in his voice. Then why are you letting it happen? Luke swallowed hard. Harold, Officer Matthews, he's got connections. He's had me written up before for insubordination, and last time he said he could end my career if I didn't play ball. I don't like what he does, but I can't stop him. Lucas softened her tone. Luke, that baggie wasn't mine. You know that. He nodded, pain flickering in his eyes. I know. I saw him toss it near you, but I didn't say anything. I froze. Lucas leaned forward. Why are you telling me this now? Luke glanced at the door again. Because I can't keep doing this. It's not why I joined the force. Look, if you get a lawyer, if you somehow get out of this, you need to make sure this never happens again. He paused. I have to go before he comes back. Before Lucas could ask more, Luke disappeared, leaving Lucas alone once again. A sense of cautious relief washed over her. There was at least one potential ally in this place. She settled back in the chair, thinking through her options. If Luke would testify or provide a statement, that could help expose Harold's tactics. But Lucas still had her bigger mission, to root out corruption in the precinct as its new captain. She was determined not to blow her cover just yet. It was nearly dawn by the time Lucas was released from the interrogation room and returned to the holding cell. She surmised that the shift was changing soon, which might bring fresh faces and fresh opportunities. She found the cell now empty, giving her a moment of respite. She lay down on the metal bench, exhausted but too anxious to sleep. Minutes later, she heard footsteps approaching. A female officer, a sergeant by her stripes, peered through the bars. Lucas James. Lucas sat up. Yes, that's me. The woman unlocked the cell, motioning Lucas to step out. You're being moved to an interview room upstairs. Apparently someone from the top wants to talk to you. Lucas's eyes flickered with curiosity. From the top? Could it be someone who recognized who she really was? She followed the sergeant, ascending a flight of concrete stairs to the second floor. The hallway here was quieter, the doors bearing nameplates of higher-ranking officers. She was led into a clean, well-lit office with a nameplate that read, Lieutenant Carol Peterson. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. She knew that name from briefings about the precinct. Lieutenant Peterson was rumored to be tough but fair, a straight arrow in a sometimes crooked system. "Have a seat," the sergeant said, unfastening Lucas's handcuffs. "Lieutenant Peterson will be with you shortly." The sergeant left, closing the door gently. Lucas exhaled. She rubbed her sore wrists, glancing around the office. A framed certificate from Northwestern University hung on one wall, along with a photo of Peterson shaking hands with the mayor of Chicago. Lucas waited, her mind racing, until the door opened again. Lieutenant Carol Peterson entered, a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took a seat behind her desk, folding her hands in front of her. "Miss James," she began in a soft but controlled voice, "I understand you were arrested last night for possession of a controlled substance." Lucas met her gaze. "Yes, that's what I've been told." Peterson leaned forward. "I also understand that the officer in question is Harold Matthews. Is that correct?" Lucas nodded, saying nothing more. Peterson sighed, a mix of frustration and resignation crossing her face. "Look, I don't recognize you personally, but I've read your name somewhere. Lucas James. You have no priors. You recently returned to Chicago from Boston. My question is, do you have any reason to believe that the drugs found near you might have been planted?" Lucas was cautious. "I'm certain they were planted. But do I have proof?" "Not yet." Peterson tapped a pen against the desk, her eyes scanning Lucas's posture and expression. "Officer O'Donnell came to me in confidence this morning, just before I was about to leave my shift. He claims he saw Officer Matthews drop a small bag near your foot. That's a serious allegation." Lucas's pulse quickened. Luke had gone to Peterson. He'd taken a real risk. "It is serious," Lucas said quietly. "He'd be telling the truth if that's what he told you." Peterson nodded slowly. "I have no love for dirty cops. But we have to follow protocol. I can't just take your word for it, or O'Donnell's. I need hard evidence. Body cam footage, security camera recordings, or a credible witness statement that can hold up under scrutiny." Lucas listened carefully. She knew from experience that a single honest lieutenant could be a powerful ally. Yet she couldn't reveal her own rank without risking the entire operation. "I understand. But if you release me on my own recognizance, I can help you find that evidence. Or at least I can show you where to look." Peterson raised an eyebrow. "You're not a detective. Are you a PI or something?" Lucas bit her lip. This was the moment. She could come clean, but that might jeopardize her entire plan. On the other hand, Peterson might be more cautious if she knew who Lucas was. Finally, Lucas decided to reveal a piece of truth, but not everything. "Lieutenant Peterson, I've worked in law enforcement for years in Boston. I transferred here for an upcoming position. I have contacts who can verify this. If you process me as a detainee and throw me back in a cell, you'll just cause more headaches for yourself once the truth surfaces. Let me prove my innocence." Peterson studied her face for a long moment. "I'll place you in a temporary holding room upstairs while I make some calls. Understand that if you try to leave this building, I'll have no choice but to consider you a flight risk." Lucas nodded. "I understand." Peterson kept her word, moving Lucas to a small office with a desk, a single window, and a guarded door. She was still technically in custody, but at least she was out of the cell. Hours ticked by, and Lucas paced the room, mentally rehearsing what she'd say if forced to disclose her impending captaincy. She wondered if Chief Morris had gotten wind of her arrest. If so, the chief might already be working behind the scenes. Eventually the door swung open. Peterson stepped in, eyes narrowed with curiosity. "I just got off the phone with someone pretty high up, a Chief Morris. He had a lot to say about you." Lucas inhaled sharply. Here it comes, she thought. She braced herself. "You're the incoming Captain Lucas James, aren't you?" Peterson asked quietly. Lucas exhaled, feeling both relief and dread. "Yes, Lieutenant, I am." Peterson's eyes flashed with anger, not at Lucas, but at the situation. She set her hands on her hips. "Why didn't you identify yourself last night? You could have avoided this entire ordeal." Lucas met her gaze, voice steady. Because I had suspicions about misconduct in this precinct, and I wanted to observe it firsthand. You have no idea how sorry I am that I ended up in this position, but it confirms my worst fears, that there are indeed officers like Matthews abusing their power." Peterson let out a sharp breath. "Chief Morris wants you released immediately, of course, but the paperwork is a mess. I'm trying to keep this quiet until we figure out how to proceed. Matthews doesn't know who you are yet." "Good," Lucas said firmly. "Let's keep it that way for just a little bit longer. If he realizes who I am, he'll destroy whatever evidence might exist, if he hasn't already." Peterson gave Lucas a cautious look. "What exactly do you propose, Captain?" Lucas paused, carefully choosing her words. "For now, release me without disclosing my identity to the rank and file. Let me go home and rest. Then I'll come in next week as planned, officially. In the meantime, you can quietly gather any body cam footage from last night and see what still exists. Officer O'Donnell might have more information. I want us to have a solid case against Matthews." Peterson considered Lucas's plan. "You're playing a dangerous game. Matthews has connections, and if he catches wind of who you are, he'll be on high alert." Lucas nodded. "That's why we have to move carefully. Also, we need to keep O'Donnell safe. If Matthews suspects Luke snitched, it could end Luke's career, or worse." Peterson pursed her lips. "All right, I'll let you walk out of here, but I'll have to mark the charges as pending until we can officially dismiss them. That means, on paper, you're still out on bail for possession. It's the only way I can justify your release without raising suspicion." Lucas smiled grimly. "Do what you have to do." For the next few days, Lucas laid low in her rented apartment. Despite her exhaustion, she barely slept, anxiously awaiting updates from Peterson. She spent hours on her laptop, preparing files and combing through old departmental records she'd requested from Boston. She wanted to ensure that once she stepped into her new position, she'd do so armed with comprehensive knowledge of best practices and a bulletproof strategy for tackling corruption. Finally, she received a text from Lieutenant Peterson. Collected body cam footage from O'Donnell and Matthews. Very suspicious gap in Matthews' recording. O'Donnell's camera shows partial angle, enough to suspect wrongdoing. We'll talk soon. Lucas's heart fluttered with satisfaction. They had partial footage. Harold Matthews had likely switched off his body cam at a critical moment, but Luke's camera might have captured him reaching into his pocket. That was the kind of evidence Lucas needed to press charges. Just then, Lucas's phone chimed again. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" "Hey, it's Luke. Officer O'Donnell," the voice whispered. "I got your number from Lieutenant Peterson. I need to meet you. There's more you should know." Lucas checked the time. 9 p.m. The city was still buzzing with nightlife, but she sensed urgency in Luke's voice. "All right." "Where?" "An all-night diner on 35th. There's a sign that says Donna's Diner." "I'll be in a corner booth. I can't be seen with you near the station," Luke said, then abruptly hung up. Lucas grabbed her coat and keys, slipping out of her apartment. She drove through the Chicago streets, passing the illuminated marquee of the Chicago Theater and the vibrant nightlife before she turned onto quieter roads. She arrived at the modest diner, its fluorescent sign flickering against the dark sky. Inside, the smell of bacon grease and old coffee permeated the air. She spotted Luke in a booth by the window, nervously swirling a cup of coffee. "Officer O'Donnell," Lucas greeted softly as she slid into the booth opposite him. He glanced around. "Thanks for coming, Captain, or Ms. James, I'm not sure what to call you right now." Lucas offered a small smile. "Lucas is fine for now." Luke leaned forward, his voice low. "Matthews is onto something. He's suspicious that the charges against you haven't progressed. He keeps asking me questions, wanting to make sure I stick to the official story. I think he senses that I might talk." Lucas kept her face impassive. "What else has he done?" Luke's hands shook slightly as he lifted the coffee cup. "He's threatened me, basically. Said if I go soft or rat him out, there's going to be trouble. I don't know what to do. I've tried to talk to a few of the other guys at the station, but they're all used to his ways. They say, "Don't cross Harry. He'll bury you." Lucas's gaze hardened. "He won't bury you, Luke. I promise." She paused, lowering her voice further. "Have you heard any specifics about how Matthews has maintained such power? Is there a larger network of corruption?" Luke glanced out the window at passing headlights, as though someone might be watching. "I'm not sure. He's always bragging about having a cousin in the city council, some buddy in the DA's office, that kind of thing. He's also rumored to have run side hustles, like pocketing cash from drug dealers in exchange for protection. I never witnessed it, but I've heard the rumors. The guys at the station talk behind his back, but nobody does anything." Lucas nodded. Her instincts told her that Matthews wouldn't be a lone wolf. Corruption often thrived in clusters, especially in big city police departments with a history of nepotism. "Luke, I appreciate your honesty. Just hang in there a bit longer. I'm officially starting my position in a few days. Once I'm in uniform, we'll move swiftly against him. Meanwhile, if you can document anything, any suspicious transactions, any threats, keep a record." Luke frowned. "All right, but I'm scared. The moment he finds out you're our new captain—" "He will," Lucas interrupted. "And soon. But by then, we'll have enough evidence to neutralize him. Trust me." Luke nodded, though fear still clouded his eyes. "I do. I'm just worried about retaliation." Lucas felt a twinge of empathy. She remembered being a rookie officer in Boston, seeing shady deals go down, and wondering if speaking up would end her career or endanger her family. "Lieutenant Peterson and I will protect you," she reassured him, "but we need your help to bring Matthews down lawfully. If we cut corners, it'll undermine our entire case." Their conversation continued for another half-hour, quietly strategizing. Lucas left the diner feeling a mix of determination and dread. She knew that in a matter of days she'd confront Matthews not as a random suspect, but as his commanding officer. The real question was whether she could gather enough proof and secure enough alliances to make it stick when the hammer fell. The morning Lucas was set to officially begin her role as captain arrived cold and overcast. A thin drizzle fell as she parked her car in the 12th Precinct's lot. She wore her freshly pressed captain's uniform, the CPD badge gleaming on her chest. Through the rain-spotted windshield, she could see the building that, less than a week ago, she'd entered in handcuffs. She took a breath, centering herself. Chief Morris had planned to publicly introduce her at a special roll call. He insisted on making a statement about progress, accountability, and a fresh perspective in the department. Lucas had agreed, but privately she knew this announcement would send shockwaves, especially for Harold Matthews. She stepped out of her car, walking briskly through the drizzle. Her uniform hat shielded most of the rain, but droplets trickled down her collar. As she entered the station's lobby, heads turned. Officers, detectives, and administrative staff paused to watch the tall, poised black woman in a captain's uniform stride through the doors. A desk sergeant she recognized from her booking stared, his jaw slack. Lucas nodded politely at him, then continued toward the muster room. There, rows of officers and detectives were seated, waiting for the shift briefing. Lucas stood at the front alongside Chief Morris, who wore a solemn expression. "Morning, everyone," Chief Morris began, clearing his throat. "I'd like to introduce you to Captain Lucas James, the newest addition to our leadership team. She comes to us with a decade of experience from the East Coast, specializing in community engagement and internal oversight. We're fortunate to have her." Polite applause followed. Lucas scanned the crowd, spotting Luke in the second row, his face tinged with nerves. Then her gaze locked onto Harold Matthews, standing in the back with his arms folded across his chest. His expression was one of pure astonishment. He recognized her instantly. She saw the color drain from his face. For a moment, their eyes locked in a silent battle. When the applause died down, Lucas stepped to the podium. She spoke calmly, addressing the assembled officers. "Thank you, Chief, and thank you all for welcoming me today. My philosophy is simple. Policing is a privilege. We serve the community, and we owe it to them to do so with honor, honesty, and empathy. Her gaze briefly flickered to Harold. I look forward to working with each of you to uphold these values and maintain the highest standards of accountability. After the briefing, Lucas was swarmed by various officers, offering their handshakes and warm welcomes. Harold hovered near the edges, his jaw clenched. Finally he approached, his voice tense and quiet. Captain James, small world. Lucas offered him a tight smile. Isn't it, Officer Matthews? She replied smoothly. He lowered his voice further, leaning in. You set me up, didn't you? Lucas met his glare with a level stare. Funny. That's exactly what you tried to do to me. Before Harold could respond, Lucas turned to greet another officer. She felt his eyes boring into her back, but she refused to let him rattle her. Today she was in charge, and she would use that authority to unmask his corruption. Over the following week, Lucas took swift, strategic steps to cement her leadership and isolate Harold's influence. She held private meetings with Lieutenant Peterson to review the partial body cam footage from Luke's device. While it didn't fully show the bag drop, it did show Harold fumbling in his pocket just before Lucas was arrested. Combined with Luke's statement, the evidence was mounting. Peterson also discovered something else: discrepancies in Harold's past arrest reports. Suspects, most of them young black men, claimed Harold had planted drugs. The claims had been dismissed for lack of evidence or overshadowed by other charges. But now a pattern emerged. Lucas recognized the pattern instantly: identical phrasing in Harold's incident reports, improbable chain of custody logs, and so on. One afternoon, Lucas called Luke into her office. He entered, visibly anxious. Lucas gestured for him to sit. Officer O'Donnell, she began, Lieutenant Peterson and I have reviewed your testimony and the footage from your body cam. We believe we have enough to open an internal investigation into Officer Matthews. Luke exhaled, relief mingling with dread. So, it's happening? Lucas nodded. Yes, but I need one final piece. A direct admission from Matthews or any corroborating evidence that he's done this repeatedly. We can present the pattern, but that alone may not guarantee administrative or criminal charges against him. He'll just claim it's coincidence or blame sloppy paperwork. Luke swallowed. I'm willing to help, but how do we get him to admit anything? Lucas leaned forward, fingers steepled. I propose a controlled conversation. If you can get him talking, maybe about me, maybe about his other setups, while wearing a wire, that might push him to reveal enough for an airtight case. Luke's face blanched. A wire? That's risky. If he finds out. He won't, Lucas said firmly. We'll do it discreetly, with Lieutenant Peterson overseeing it. You'll be safe. She softened her tone. Luke, I understand how scary this is. I've been in situations where I had to go undercover to expose corruption. But we need someone close to him, someone he trusts. And that person is you. Luke clenched his jaw, summoning courage. All right, Captain, I'll do it. I'm tired of living in fear. Lucas nodded, admiration in her eyes. We'll set it up for tomorrow. The next day, Lucas, Peterson and Luke met early in a small conference room. Peterson carefully attached a wire to Luke's undershirt, testing the audio levels. Lucas gave Luke a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You've got this, she said. Just talk to him like you normally would, show your usual hesitation, and see if he volunteers any incriminating details. Luke nodded, pale, but determined. Okay. They planned to catch Harold in a moment of casual downtime, maybe in the station's break room or locker room. Luke left the conference room first, wandering toward the break room. Lucas and Peterson slipped into an observation room connected to the building's older CCTV system. Though the cameras were primarily for public areas, they had audio channels for training in the break room, something Harold might not even be aware of or suspect. Time ticked by. Lucas and Peterson watched the monitors until they finally saw Luke enter the break room. Harold was there alone, sipping coffee at a worn plastic table. The tension was palpable through the screen. "Hey, Harry," Luke greeted, trying to keep his voice casual. Harold glanced up. "O'Donnell, you look like you haven't slept." Luke shrugged, sitting down across from him. He fiddled with a stir stick, letting silence linger. Eventually, he sighed. "I can't stop thinking about that Lucas James woman. I mean, Captain James." Harold's gaze sharpened. "Why? She's just some big-shot do-gooder who thinks she can waltz in and fix everything. She won't last long." Luke nodded. "Yeah, probably. But aren't you worried about what happened? I mean, you arrested her on possession, but now she's our new captain." He paused for effect. "That's not good, man." Harold clicked his tongue. "That was a fiasco, I admit, but I've handled worse." Luke's voice trembled slightly. "I just don't want any trouble coming back on us, you know? If she digs into that night—" Harold smirked darkly. "Let her. All she's got is a half-baked story and no real proof. You think the brass are going to believe the word of a new captain over the officer who's got a decade of solid police work?" Lucas and Peterson exchanged glances in the observation room, silently rooting for Luke to push further. Luke leaned in. "But if she starts asking questions about the baggie or about that tip we got in Bronzeville—" Harold scoffed. "Luke, you've got to learn how things work around here. I've done that dance plenty of times. Planting a little evidence never hurt if it gets these criminals off the street, or sends a message. The department turns a blind eye because in the end the stats look good." Lucas's pulse raced. She glanced at Peterson, who gave a subtle nod, indicating they had enough to proceed. But Luke pressed on, desperate for a clear admission. "So, you're saying you've planted evidence before?" Luke asked, feigning naive curiosity. Harold shrugged nonchalantly. "Not just me. Plenty of guys do it. I just do it better. The paperwork always matches. The chain of custody is sealed." He leaned back, sipping his coffee. "If Lucas James wants a fight, she'll regret it." Luke exhaled shakily. I hope she doesn't dig up any old cases. You know, the guys we arrested in the past." Harold waved a hand, dismissive. "Those punks had it coming. The system barely punishes them anyway. We did the city a favor." "Don't go getting soft on me, O'Donnell." Luke forced a weak smile. "Of course not, Harry. Just making sure we're on the same page." Suddenly, Lucas and Peterson saw Harold's phone ring on the table. He glanced at the caller ID. "I gotta take this. Catch you later, man." Luke offered a nod and left. Peterson turned to Lucas, excitement lighting her eyes. "We got him. I'll forward this audio to Internal Affairs." Lucas's shoulders sagged in relief. "Yes, we got him, but we need to do the takedown carefully. He's dangerous, and I don't want him to skip town." Peterson nodded. "We'll coordinate with IA and the state's attorney's office. Matthews might have a few friends in high places, but this is too damning to ignore." Within 2 hours, Lucas had arranged a special meeting in the precinct's main conference room with representatives from Internal Affairs. She requested that Harold Matthews be summoned on the pretense of urgent operational updates. Harold arrived, face drawn in confusion. Once inside, he found Lucas, Peterson, Luke, and 2 IA officers waiting. "What's this about?" Harold demanded, trying to maintain his bravado. Lucas stood at the head of the table, her captain's insignia glinting under the fluorescent lights. She spoke calmly, her voice steady. "Officer Harold Matthews, as of now, you're under investigation for multiple counts of evidence tampering, wrongful arrest, and conspiracy to violate citizens' civil rights." Harold's face turned red with anger. "You can't be serious." "Based on what?" One of the IA officers stepped forward, holding up a small recorder. "We have your conversation recorded, Officer Matthews. You admitted to planting evidence on multiple occasions." Harold's gaze flickered to Luke. A wave of fury contorted his features. "You little rat!" Luke looked down, but Lucas spoke before Harold could continue. "That's enough. You have the right to an attorney. I suggest you exercise it." Harold's eyes darted around, realizing he was cornered. "This is a setup," he bellowed, pointing at Lucas. "She's out to get me because I arrested her. She's lying. You're all lying." Lucas shook her head, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "No one forced you to say those things, Harold. You did this to yourself." The IA officers moved forward, placing Harold under arrest. He tried to resist, but a swift maneuver had him cuffed in seconds. "You're going to regret this, James," he spat. "You have no idea who I know. You're finished in this city." Lucas stepped back, letting IA do their job. She watched as they led him out of the conference room. Harold Matthews, the man who had arrogantly believed he was untouchable, now looked small, his bluster failing him. Lucas felt a wave of relief, though also a pang of sorrow that a fellow officer had fallen so deeply into corruption. Behind her, Luke exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Peterson walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, O'Donnell." Lucas nodded, extending her hand to Luke. "We couldn't have done this without you." Luke shook her hand, gratitude and lingering fear in his eyes. "Thank you for giving me the chance." Lucas offered a reassuring smile. "Now, let's get back to work. We have a precinct to rebuild." Weeks passed, and the precinct began to settle into a more transparent routine. Lucas implemented new guidelines, mandatory body cam activation for all patrols, randomized audits of arrest reports, and community outreach programs designed to rebuild trust in neighborhoods like Bronzeville. Community leaders, long disillusioned with policing, started giving Lucas cautious praise. She visited local churches, youth centers, and neighborhood councils, listening to their concerns. Slowly she saw the beginnings of a bridge forming between the police and the public. It was fragile, but it was real. Lieutenant Peterson, who had become Lucas's right-hand partner in reform, reported a drop in complaints against officers. "It's early days yet," she cautioned, "but the trend is promising." Lucas nodded. "We have a lot of work ahead, but this is how it starts, one small step at a time." As for Harold Matthews, he awaited trial. Rumor had it he was desperately trying to strike a plea deal, offering names of other corrupt cops in exchange for a reduced sentence. Whether or not the DA's office would accept was unclear, but Lucas didn't concern herself with that. She had done her part in exposing him. Now the legal system would take over. One chilly evening, Lucas decided to revisit Bronzeville, walking the same streets where she'd been unjustly arrested. This time she wore plain clothes, but the difference now was that if a patrol car pulled up, it would likely wave in recognition, not suspicion. A few neighbors even smiled and greeted her by name. She passed the coffee shop where she'd had her last latte before the ordeal. Stepping inside, the barista recognized her from local news coverage. "Hey, Captain James," the barista said, beaming. "Your latte's on the house." Lucas chuckled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. But please let me pay. We all have to support each other." She sipped her drink, strolling back into the night, the flavors as rich as the sense of hope now blossoming around her. In that moment, Lucas felt a deep connection to the city she'd once fled. Chicago was flawed, scarred by corruption and inequality, but it was her home, and she was here to protect it, to guide it toward a fairer future. As she walked, Lucas couldn't help but reflect on the winding path that led her here, the humiliating arrest, the risk of revealing her identity, the precarious alliance with Luke, and the final takedown of Harold Matthews. It had been a crucible of sorts, forging her leadership under intense pressure, but in the end, truth had prevailed, and the right people stood by her side. Now, with a fresh latte warming her hands and the city lights twinkling around her, Captain Lucas James felt more determined than ever. She thought back to her mother's words. "Sometimes we have to step away from home to see it clearly." Lucas had seen it clearly, and she had returned as a catalyst for change. Though the challenges would continue, Lucas embraced them wholeheartedly, ready to shape a new era in the Chicago Police Department, one where justice and integrity reigned over fear and corruption. Thank you for watching the incredible story of how one woman's strength and determination toppled a corrupt officer's ruthless reign. If you felt the drama, the tension, and the sweet sting of karma, we invite you to share this story with your friends and family. Remember, silence allows wrongdoing to flourish, but bravery, whether from a humble patrol officer or a determined captain, can shine a powerful light on even the darkest corners. By hitting that like button, leaving a comment, and subscribing, you support more stories of hope, justice, and transformation. Spread the word and be part of the community that believes in standing up for what's right. Let's continue to inspire change, one story at a time, together. So, like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more gripping tales that prove the power of truth. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.